roll for recipe. Let's see here. All right, 6. So player's choice, perfect. So I chose a recipe I had in one of the miscellaneous binders. This I printed off. I'll try and remember to link the website I got it off of. We are doing Pelmeni, which is a recipe that my husband's family loves. They use it in special occasions. This is not their family recipe. This dish does originate in Russia, mostly Siberia. This recipe is very involved. There's not a lot of ingredients, but there's a lot of steps. So we're going to see how that goes. I did stay up until 5 a.m. working on an art project, so I'm regretting about every life choice today. Yeah, let's get started. Our first step here is to make the dough. It says you'll need an electric mixer with a hook attachment. So we have that set up here. I'm going to double this recipe. I've made it multiple times before, so I kind of know what I'm doing. I know that's very new and exciting for anybody who's watched these videos before. I will be doubling this recipe because although it takes a lot to make it, it doesn't take a lot to cook it. So long prep time, not long cook time. It freezes really well. So I make big batches, freeze it, and then pop it out and boil it when I want to make it. So I'll try and use what the original recipe calls for ingredients, and then I'll tell you how much I'm adding since I'm doubling. So let's get to making the dough. It calls for 3 eggs. We are doubling that, so 6. I only have 6 eggs, and since eggs are crazy expensive, I'm going to crack them properly, one at a time in this bowl and then over. That way I don't mess them up. I have a shell in here. There is our 6 eggs. I'm going to clean the egg goop off the counter real quick. The next thing we need is flour. Original recipe, 4 cups. I'm doubling, so it'll be 8. And I'm going to try really hard to keep track of how many cups of flour I've added. 8. Before I grab our next ingredient, I'm going to turn the faucet on and get the water heating up because we need to add warm water. It takes a while to get warm water to the sink, so by the time I add the next ingredient, that hopefully should be warming up. The recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of Celtic salt. I don't have that, so I'm using kosher salt. I think kosher salt is a fine substitution, or if you had sea salt or pink Himalayan salt, just one of the coarser salts. Just kidding. Since I'm doubling this, we actually need 4 teaspoons of salt. I have warm water, so original recipe 1 cup of water. We need 2 cups of warm water into the bowl. Since there's a lot of stuff in this bowl, I'm going to give it a little mix before we put it on the mixer to get some of the flour wet so that it doesn't all blow all over the counter when I start mixing it. There's our dough. My mixer is going to be working very hard. This is a very thick dough. I've made sure the head's locked into place. The bowl is locked in well. After I put it on stir for not very long, just to stop some of the flour from puffing up, I'm going to start to ramp up the speed pretty quickly. There's our dough all mixed together. I feel like our dough ball is a little wetter than it normally is. I don't know if it's because I lost flour, but We will be adding more flour, so I'm not super concerned about it. It does say to form dough into ball and then cover in plastic or a towel. I usually put it into a slightly oiled bowl and then cover it. Here's the bowl we'll be using to let it rise. Oop. I just pour a little bit of oil in there, maybe like a tablespoon at most. I go up the edges and make sure they're covered really well, all the way to the top. Just because this dough is super sticky, it's always super sticky. We're going to be fighting it to get it out of that bowl, so I try to make the fight to get it out of this bowl less hard. I try and clean off as much dough as I can off the hook. All right, let's try and get some of this into this bowl. We're going to be using this bowl, so I'm just going to put it back on the mixer. And then cover this with a towel or plastic wrap and let it rest at room temperature for 30 minutes. I don't really time it. I mix the filling and kind of get all those ingredients together. And then when I'm done with that, I assume it's been at least 30 minutes. There are a few things I would recommend doing before you start this next step. If you are going to cook this as soon as it's done, I would probably think about getting your pot out and filling it with water. My pot that I use is very large, so it takes a while to heat up. The only reason I use a super large pot is when I'm cooking it. If I use just my regular pot, I'll do a batch and give it to Tyler, and then he'll eat it before the second batch is done, and then I'll just give it to him, and then I'm eating dinner way after him because I'll just give the hot stuff to him. So I use a giant pot so that we can eat kind of at the same time. So that's one thing you can do. If you're freezing it like I am, at least part of this, here's another thing I would recommend doing before you start mixing your ingredients. I've been told, and I find that it's best to freeze them flat and then take them off of these and put them in a bag. If you don't, they'll kind of form a giant blob in the bag, so you don't want that. I have a cookie sheet that I've covered in plastic wrap, and then I'll put a little bit of flour on it before we start throwing them on to cover it, and then I'll put it in the deep freeze flat. Another thing, if you don't have giant cookie sheets, is I'm using a cake board that I also cover in plastic and I'll put flour on. You can get these in the cake decorating section at Walmart. Not very expensive. I don't remember how much. But I just save this one and use it for Pelmeni. The next thing we need to do is make the filling. So you'll need the whisk attachment for your mixer. I scraped out the mixing bowl as much as possible. I usually just throw the other ingredients in there with a little bit of leftover dough, and it doesn't seem to be a problem usually. The first thing we need is 1 pound of ground beef or pork. I've seen recipes use both or both and venison. I think it's really like a player's choice. It's from Siberia. I'm sure it's whatever they had killed that week was the meat that ended up in Pelmeni. So, since we're doubling, we're using 2 pounds of ground beef. Make sure it's defrosted because we're going to be whisking it. So it should be thawed thoroughly. The next step is 3 tablespoons, 6 tablespoons for us, of green onions chopped. I usually do kind of a coarser chop. Usually I cut them into rings and then kind of cut those in half is the kind of chop I'm doing, so not super fine. Throw those in here. Once again, you're supposed to use Celtic salt, but I'm using kosher salt. It says 1 to 2 teaspoons. So since we're doubling, I'm going to do 3 and call it good. Let's have a chat about our next ingredient here. Per the recipe, it would like you to grate 1 large onion, so for us 2. And I think these probably equal out to about 2 large onions. I today do not have the willingness to grate onions. The goal is to grate them fine, I believe, not super fine. So let's look at our sides here. You have the large, the tiny, and the medium. I usually do the medium. I prefer the taste this way. It obviously gets them super fine. It blends into the beef really well. The problem is that you are causing harm to the onions and they are trying to protect themselves. This causes slow harm. So I've tried like the putting the toothpick in your mouth. I still had full dripping off my chin tears. The only way I have found to do it where I can still see what I'm doing and not grade my fingertips off is to actually wear like swimming goggles. And I'm just not feeling that today. So I'm going to use the food processor, but there's a few things you need to know about that. I am just using the little Ninja food processor. And I don't do them all at once. I do them in batches, and here's kind of why. I try to give them a quick little dice to make them kind of even. So I have about half of the larger of the 2 onions in there right now. Maybe if you had a better food processor, it wouldn't be as much of an issue, but this kind of cuts them unevenly. So there's still tears involved in this process, but I give it a quick couple pulses and then try and scrape some of the stuff on the side down. Please don't stick your fingers in here with the blade. I push it all down and then do a couple more quick pulses. Maybe if you had a better food processor, it wouldn't be as much of an issue, but this is what I have. Grating is the preferred method, but like I said, it's a long, painful process. So this is going to have very fine to not as fine in it. Like there's some that is a paste, and then you also have bigger chunks. So that's the downside of this method. And like I said, it's still painful because you are food processing onions, but it's a lot less painful than the grating. Here's all our ingredients in the mixer. As you can see, there are like larger chunks of onion in there with the smaller chunks. Nope. Our whisk attachment's on. I'm locking the head in place, making sure the bowl's on good, and we're gonna get this going. I think it looks pretty good. It just says mix until the mixture looks even. It looks pretty even to me. I'm just going to go through kind of what my rolling station looks like real quick before we get going. Make sure to take off any watches or jewelry because they'll have flour all over them by the end. I'm going to be using these rolling mats. They're silicone. You can get them off Amazon really cheap. I recommend having a lot of space for this process. If you don't have a lot of space, I recommend making a friend that has a bigger kitchen. You could probably use a dining room table if you have one, or maybe get like a card table and use it somewhere and roll it out. I know that like my mother-in-law, when she makes this recipe, for her table, she'll cover the crack in the middle with tape so that flour doesn't fall through onto the floor. You'll need a rolling pin, which here's my rolling pin. I do think bigger's better in this case, at least. Just because I think with a bigger rolling pin, you can get more pressure because you're going to have to try and roll this dough out pretty thin. A dough knife. Currently my meat mixture is in the fridge just because it's going to be sitting out for a while. I wanted to cool it down some. I did forget to add pepper to our meat mixture. It just says to add a few turns of freshly ground pepper. So I sprinkled some on top. When I pull it out of the fridge, I'll mix it in better. The recipe doesn't call for this in their instructions. I find this is easier. I usually get a cup of water and a pastry brush to help me seal edges of the dough. I have flour everywhere. I have a pile here that I'll spread out when I throw the dough out. I have another pile of flour over here so I can dip my rolling pins in the utensil I'm going to show you here in a minute in it. We need to divide the dough first, so we'll start there. All right, I'm going to dump the dough out, so we are going to spread a little bit of flour out. And although you oiled the bowl, it probably still won't come out super easy. All right, now that our dough is out, I'm going to sprinkle some flour on top. And by some, I mean actually quite a bit. As we're going to start working with it here a little bit, and I don't want it to get super stuck to everything like it is. Probably should have put more flour underneath of it, but I'm going to ball it up here a little bit. Probably adding this much flour to it right away is not ideal, but I need to be able to work with it, and it is a super sticky dough. We're going to try and get some even kind of sections here. You need to divide the dough into fours. The 3 parts that we aren't working with, I am rewrapping in plastic and putting to the side. I'm just going to cut a little bit off actually, and then I'll set this to the side and come back to that. She said to roll it into a thin sausage-looking shape, which I think is not the most descriptive. And then use the dough knife to cut it into equal-ish pieces, eyeballing it. She said it will look a lot like Italian, I'm probably saying this wrong, gnocchi. That's not perfect. I've never been perfect at eyeballing dough sizes. Not a skill I have. Put a little bit of flour there. Make sure to coat your rolling pin really well in flour. Coat it on both sides. It says to roll it out into a pancake size. I'm assuming we mean the smaller size of pancake. I'm just trying to flip it over a few times, make sure it's still staying really well covered in flour. I think that's about pancake size. I don't know if you can tell, but the dough's really thin. Like you can see light through the dough, and that's kind of what we're going for. All right, for this next step, you need the meat mixture that I've been keeping in the refrigerator. So you need 1 teaspoon of the meat mixture right there in the center, and then bring the edges of the dough over and seal the edges to make a half moon. Like that. And this might be a little too much dough. All right, there's our little half moon of dough. Here's why I think that's too much dough, because there's a lot of extra here on the seam. Bring the 2 pointed edges of the dough together in the center and make sure they are pinched together well. Yeah, this is way too much dough. It's fine. So it forms something like that. So there's one method for pelmeni, the original method. Roll our dough out. This I'm less concerned if it's a perfect circle or not. We still want it to be kind of thin. So in my attempts to try and make this process easier, I I did try a few different methods. One is getting, this isn't a ravioli press, but it came in a set with them, is something like that. And cutting a circle out. You can't really put a whole teaspoon of filling in this guy because it's so tiny. And then pinch the edges really good, folding over a little bit if I have to. Voila, there's that little guy. I have tried with like an actual ravioli press here. Obviously it's not round, so you're losing some of the actual pelmeni-ness of it. You can get the full teaspoon of filling in there. So there's that with the ravioli press. Still not pretty, not my favorite, not very easy still. This is how I like to do it. This is called the Little Pierogi Maker. I found this on Amazon when I was hunting for ways to make pelmeni easier. It's by this brand, Hunky Bills. I think I looked a couple months ago and they were going for like $20 to $30. One modification I made is sometimes I don't have the mats to roll it out. So I went to the hardware store and got Plasti Dip and Plasti dipped the little legs. This is just hard plastic. So when I was rolling it, which I'll show you what I mean here in a minute, it would slip on the plain countertop. This is how we're going to make pelmeni. Mix this around in the flour to make sure the surface gets some flour on it. It'll help the dough from not sticking as much. So we're gonna roll it. We're gonna try and get it thin. Like I was saying, you wanna be able to see light through it. I try and change directions. Since our little pierogi press is a circle, I try and get this kind of circular. It doesn't work out usually. And this is something that you just have to play with a lot. Like, you figure out what thickness of dough actually works, what method you like, what method is more practical. If you're not doing this very often, probably don't go out and buy a little pierogi press for it. Pat some of the extra flour off our surface here. Make sure that the surface is pretty well covered with dough. You can kind of see the ridges here for where those little pierogi cutouts are. I just very lightly am kind of going over this with water. You can kind of see a little better where the ridges are. That will help us fill it. A teaspoon of filling in each one. I try and roll it a little bit and then stick it in the middle there. My dough to meat ratio never works out. The way she has me make it uses a lot more dough, so it probably equals out if you're hand rolling. There's all our meat in there. The next thing we do is I'm going to set our pierogi press off to the side and bring our next section of dough here to the middle. Same process. Move our little pierogi maker back here in the middle and then bring our slab of dough over top. Same thing, making sure the dough is covering all of the pierogi maker. You can stretch it out a little bit if you need to. I take my rolling pin and kind of do a quick little press all over like that. And then you go over top and roll it. Like that. Then, as you can see, the hard plastic cuts the dough. So you take this extra dough skirt off. You take your little pierogi maker and flip it over. Sometimes they all come out. Sometimes you have to help a little bit. And then you break them apart. You start lining up the pelmeni here on the cookie sheet. There's all our pelmeni on the cooking sheet. When I put them on the cookie sheet, I try to line them up in pretty good rows. The longer they sit here, the longer I think more moisture kind of seeps through the dough and they start to stick together. So giving some space between each one kind of helps that not happen. So I did not end up making the pelmeni to eat the same day that I rolled it all. This is the next day. I do have kosher salt in the water. I couldn't really tell you how much I put in there. I just kind of measure with my heart. Here's our little pelmeni. They have been in the freezer for a little bit, so they're a little bit hard. Before I put them into the water, I just try and tap some of the extra flour off. As you can tell, they're kind of sticking to the bottom. So I just give them a quick little stir and make sure they're not stuck. When they're fresh, they seem to stick worse. They had started to freeze a little bit since I just popped them in the freezer while I was cleaning up. When I take them out of the freezer from the batches that I've previously freezed, I cook them closer to like 10 to 15 minutes. When they're fresh, I cook them closer to 8 minutes. So I'm going to just go with 10 since they were starting to freeze. So I'll cover them up and set a timer for 10 minutes. While my pelmeni is cooking, let's go over some things that I have seen served with it. The recipe I'm using has 2 different dipping sauces on it. If I remember correctly, they're both kind of cream based. Here are some things that my husband has put on it, or I've seen other people put on it. Rice vinegar, apple cider vinegar, country bobs. If you don't know what this is, the best way I can describe it is it's somewhere between barbecue sauce and A1 steak sauce. Ketchup. Our pelmeni is done. I'll give you a better look at my pot. As you can see, it's giant. So what I normally do is scoop them out with a slotted spoon, something with drain holes in it. And I try and tap as much moisture out of here as possible.